Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Alan Brown, please.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just ask Mr Bain, just briefly, you said you're looking for a youth mobility scheme, so what are youths missing out on at the moment and what needs to change?
I think when you talk to schools and chambers around the UK, but also when you engage with our peer organisations across the EU and also many of the embassies, there is a sense that it's become a lot more difficult to arrange things like bilateral visits. Obviously, there is no scheme that is analogous to that in the Australia and New Zealand trade agreements that the UK has signed, which permits youth mobility for up to 3 years for under 35s. So that's something that was not in the TCA and is a clear area where we would like to see a supplementary agreement agreed in this first review process in 2026.
Okay, thanks.
I think the other area as well, I think for Mr Brown is also around services and the really tough rules around labour mobility and business travel, particularly affecting those providing services. So we hope that's something else that can be addressed in the review.
Okay, thanks. That takes me to Professor Barnard. So we've already heard there from Mr Bain, youth mobility needs improved, labour access, the sale of agri-goods needs to be streamlined or improved. But what's your reading of the potential scope of the TCA review process, particularly considering how EU institutions and member states view it? Is there scope for widespread negotiations and changes and improvements?
Thank you very much for this. I would say that the scope of 776, Article 776 is quite narrow. It just talks about review of the implementation. Some people have put weight on the next part of the sentence, which says, and any matters related thereto. The question is political will. And all that I'm hearing, and I had the privilege of interviewing Maros Sefcovic a couple of weeks ago, is that at the moment the Commission is determined to damp down expectations that this is not going to be lead to radical change. But of course the politics may change for the reasons that we've already heard. But remember too that when the TCA was agreed, there was much emphasis placed on supplementary agreements. And this was envisaged in the sandwich structure of the TCA. As you know, the TCA has common provisions across the top on institutions that we've heard about, and common provisions across the bottom in terms of dispute settlement. And it was always intended that the agreement be fleshed out with further supplementary arrangements. Now, the question then is, how do you get to the point of a supplementary agreement? And if the EU takes a view that they are going to need a mandate from the member states before the Commission can negotiate any supplementary agreement, then this is going to take longer than perhaps we might anticipate. The other thing it's worth emphasising is that with the current range of Commission officials, there is Brexit fatigue. They've essentially been thinking and negotiating around Brexit since 2016, and there's not much appetite for doing more at the moment. And of course, they've got other large issues on their plates. So again, this may sound a council of low expectation and low delivery. On the other hand, I think we should also bear in mind that 776 is perhaps not the gateway to radical transformation, not least because the Commission's view is there's quite a lot of room within the framework of the TCA to do more. My fellow panellists have outlined what that might be. And of course, some things can still be done via the Partnership Council, that's the political body, without the need to go through any supplementary agreement.
These alternate negotiations, would that allow much more radical changes, like what I was just talking about, like what Mr Bain's saying is required? Is that a realistic proposition?
All of these are realistic propositions, whether there's will on the EU side. In my view, the two areas where there is perhaps most scope for negotiation with the EU foreign security policy of some sort. And also on cultural matters, we've talked about youth mobility schemes, but also I think there is some mutual interest about the exchange of the ability for actors, musicians to be able to move, because both sides are being affected by the fact that the very limited provisions in the TCA on services do not include musicians, which is one of the reasons why they are protesting so long and loud about what's in the TCA at the moment.
What does the UK need to concede to allow that to happen for musicians?
Well, this is right, and I mean, I understand from the UK's point of view that any concessions on mobility risk being conflated with free movement, but I think this ship has absolutely sailed. Any concessions on either youth mobility or mobility for a wider group of people than is currently envisaged in the annex to the TCA is a far cry from free movement. They are coming for short periods of time. The issue is, particularly for actors and musicians at the moment, is because they're not covered by any of the provisions in the TCA. Therefore, they're going to have to get work permits every time they move to another country. And if you're there for a gig and you might be getting £1,000 and you're going to Spain and it's €600 already to get the work permit and several weeks to try and wait for the process, it's just not worth your while. And that's why they would like some sort of agreement. And the UK too will have to concede as far as that's concerned. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Okay, can I just turn to Anton? So just on that, I've got a quote from Stephen Furing, head of the European Commission's TCA unit, and he said, "There's almost on a bi-weekly basis a report on how to improve the existing Brexit deal coming from the Tony Blair Institute," who's referencing your organisation, the UK and Changing Europe, the House of Lords, but he's not aware of anything that's come out of the EU system. So are you howling in the dark, for want of a phrase, or is there realistic prospects of change that you see?
I'm really delighted Mr. Furing is reading the reports that we are producing at the Sunday Institute. But I did actually have exchange with the European Commission about some of these questions. And what I would say is it's really important to think about any future changes that the UK government may want to make to the overall UK-EU relationships in three different ways. There is a set of changes the UK government can make unilaterally, regardless of any TCA review process or any future negotiations. And that is actually there is actually a set of, in my view, a sensible domestic policy choices that could make a real difference to the way that the trading relationship is working and doesn't involve any negotiation at all. An example of this would be recognizing the CE marking on products that are placed on the UK market beyond the current deadline, which ends at the end of 2024. That would make a real tangible difference. There is then the second bucket of issues which are purely about implementation and which, in my view, are covered by the TCA review process, and those are things that the TCA already provides for. An example of this would be electricity trading scheme, which has not been agreed within the current agreement, but there is a provision within the TCA which allows the two sides to have a meaningful, detailed discussion about it. And there is a couple of areas where progress can be made.
Why is that not happening? And I quoted earlier on, Energy UK saying the current electricity trading arrangements adding £1 billion a year to our electricity bills. So why does there not seem to be prioritisation of that?
It's a very good question. I believe it's a function of politics and the way that the relationship has evolved in the last couple of years, and it's only very recently that we've got to a point where there is a little bit of equilibrium politically in the relationship. And I do agree with Professor Barnard. I think there is a bit of Brexit fatigue in the EU institutions. But I also think, I think that is a real challenge for the next UK government. There will need to be a real focus not only on what the UK government wants to achieve, whether it is through the TCA review process or some new political process, but actually there needs to be a real focus on what the EU is after in all of this. What are the EU's interests? And I think we need to switch this discussion from looking at the list of asks from the UK government to actually trying to identify an agenda of mutual policy interests that the UK and the EU have. And I think there is quite a lot actually where the TCA is structurally inadequate, in my view. An example of this would be cooperation on issues of strategic interest, like foreign policy, or defense, or decarbonization, or regulation of future technologies. All of these issues are basically left out of the TCA as it stands. It's indisputable, in my view, that the UK and the EU...
That was a political choice, effectively.
It was a political choice at the time when the TCA was concluded. My argument would be that the world has moved on since the Brexit days, and we now see a whole set of different challenges that we are facing. And in a geopolitically fragmented world where the UK and the EU are essentially two incredibly close strategic partners and allies, we need to look afresh at some of those provisions and inadequacies of TCA. But equally, I do think that the review process, and this is where I do agree with Mr. Fearing from the Commission, the TCA review process does not provide a vehicle for those changes. I think if we do want this kind of changes, we'll need to look for a more political mechanism, which will be a reflection of the shared desire of both sides to actually address some of those difficulties.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Gullis, please.